The objective today is to enter basic shell commands and navigate through man pages. So these are my Linux lessons, and today we'll go through first the hardware requirements to install a Linux operating system. Hopefully before you watch this lesson you have one ready to go. But just in case you don't, let me just cover what that means to have these certain hardware requirements, and then you can install and start doing the things we cover in this lesson. So the second thing we'll cover in this lesson will be the terminal versus the shell. That is some semantics there, some vocabulary we'll cover. I need to introduce bash to you guys. After that, we're going to talk about the difference between a regular user versus the root user, and talk a little bit about GUIs versus CLI. Hopefully by now you know what these stand for. If not, we'll cover that in a second. Then I just want to encourage you to have no fear when you're beginning these Linux lessons. These lessons I feel like are going to be a little bit like eat your vegetables lessons, because this is what the professionals use. You want to get yourself ready for the professional tech world by just understanding and using Linux a lot more. And so that's the last thing we'll do in the lesson is use some simple commands on a Linux command line. So through that table of contents, I basically gave you this introduction right here that I prepared for you, but I just want to start the lesson with a very focused mindset. We're going to become fluent in the command line, and so we're going to ease into typing on this thing we call the command line. So at this point, you should have a working Linux terminal. If not, you can still learn quite a bit from these lessons, but nothing beats practicing these concepts yourself. And when you hear me say a Linux terminal, that means you're running a shell, and it'll look something like this, not this shell of a backpack. And to be running this, you needed certain hardware to get started. So before you install a Linux distribution, check your hardware, see what you're working with. So depending on the system you're using, or depending on if you just have a box right now that is holding a brand new computer, you can read the specifications on the box. But for most distributions here, you're going to have on their website a hardware compatibility list, abbreviated HCL. And the great thing about Linux is this operating system is famous for bringing old dead machines back to life, meaning the requirements are not very high and it just makes systems run better than they did before. So let's take a look at a very special HCL here for a Fedora Linux distribution. And again, these numbers are an at minimum kind of number. So at minimum, you need a CPU that works at 1 gigahertz. You'll need at least 1 gigabyte of RAM. Don't think I've ever seen a computer in the last 10 years with less than 2 gigabytes of RAM. This requirement shouldn't be difficult, but this one right here is the biggest one you want to focus on. You need to make sure on your hard disk drive you have at least 10 gigabytes of free space. Now, if you're doing a DVD installation, I have some of these discs around my classroom you can have. I have so many of them. Then, of course, you would need a DVD drive. But if you're going to just boot from the operating system, that's possible. If you're going to boot from a USB, I can show you how to do that as well. So once logged on, for you to start using the command line, you have to open that up first, right? So if you're using a Linux operating system with what's called a GUI, you'll likely just need to click the application that's called Terminal. Now, a terminal is the channel or software that allows you to communicate with the operating system's kernel. So there's a lot of different ways you can communicate with the kernel. One is through the terminal, and that's what people mean when they say through the command line. So once you start typing, you are using a certain shell to give inputs to the kernel. This word terminal shell are often used interchangeably, but there is a slight difference there. The shell is the interface, not the software program. So you can use a variety of different shells on what is going to be called the terminal. Now, for the sake of my class, we are using bash, which stands for the born again shell. But just so you know, that's not the only shell out there. There's a couple of them. So the terminal is the application or the software, right? That's the program you're using to talk to this kernel. And the shell Think of this as a difference in interface. So maybe a good comparison would be like a terminal is like an operating system. Everybody uses an operating system. Everybody uses a terminal. But the type of operating system, whether it's a Linux distribution or Windows or Mac OS, that type, those differences in interface is similar to the differences in the shells that exist. There's a variety there that not a lot of people may think about. So let's talk more about the shell known as bash. If you hear this word bash, this might be a reference to the shell, but it could also be a reference to what's called the bash language, and this is a command language. It looks very different than the computer languages many of my students have worked with. So in my beginner classes, we learn HTML and CSS. That's going to look so different than the commands you see in bash. And in my classes, we moved to JavaScript. That's also still very different than the bash command language. And there's quite a few keywords that will look strange at first, but most of these bash keywords, they connect to concepts that you are already aware of. Now, bash has been around since 1989 and is the default shell for most Linux distributions and even Mac operating systems. So when you click on a Mac, when you click terminal, you are given a bash shell. And the interesting thing is you can have multiple terminals all running different shells or the same shell. So when you think terminal, I want you to basically think window, like you would if you are on a Windows, which is a Microsoft thing, a Windows machine. And for anyone unfamiliar with technology here, I'm telling them to buckle up because this is going to happen over and over again in our lessons where we're talking about similar concepts with different names across the field of tech, mainly because of these different companies that exist and they want to label their own things in their own way. It's maddening. So, in your own words, what is the difference between a terminal and a shell, and what is a similarity? Now, you can use a terminal on another machine to access the kernel of another machine. So that's a networking thing. That's pretty spiffy that you're able to do that. You'd be working remotely, and you'd need to do this through a network. So the computer must have some sort of a network card for you to make this happen. Now, the first thing you should notice about the command line is that it shows you who you are, that is the user that's currently logged in. So if you are the root user, that is to say the administrator, see, same word for different machines, like if I'm using Microsoft, I'm probably saying administrator, but if I'm using Linux, I'm saying root. It's crazy. But if you are the root user, you'll have a pound sign. So fancy there, but all regular users will see this dollar sign. So right here we have a user named Nixcraft, and they're working on a computer. I assume this stands for workstation number 5. So Nixcraft is right now a regular user, but later they write some commands. If eventually they do something called sudo-s or sudo-tac-s, and then they put in a password, and now all of a sudden that dollar sign turned into a pound sign. Okay, I probably should have switched to this earlier. That way you can see, it should be easier to see. And you're noticing commands like grep root /etc/ /shadow. So it looks like this word grep, it actually is like a search. So Nixcraft is trying to search in a folder called etc with a file called shadow. Maybe they're trying to look at that or search in that, and they're searching for the word root actually. But they got a permission denied message. And at the very end of this, they type exit, so they're no longer the root, and they're back to the regular user. So did you notice that command that you need to log in as root, sudo-s? That's very different than a GUI, where for you to log in a new user, you usually take your mouse to a certain corner of the machine, you click a bubble or a picture of a man, and then you switch or you click the option switch user or switch accounts. Then you got to click the account you want or type in your account name. See how painful that is to use in the GUI? It's just nicer to be able to type it all out on the command line and have things happen instantaneously. So the default GUI for Fedora is called GNOME, and once you're logged in, haha, we've barely moved on from logging in and I'm this far into the lesson. But once you're logged in, you can navigate to the terminal through the Activities menu, going to Show Applications, then Utilities, and then Terminal. Or, to save yourself time, that's the whole point of this lesson, is showing you how to use the command line to save yourself time. You could, on your keyboard, just click Control, Alt, and F2, and up will pop the terminal. So see, that's so much nicer to be able to do. And I want to say I know CLI, the command line interface, it can be intimidating at first, but it's so worth learning. So let's specifically hash that out. What is the advantage of using a CLI? I just went over it, so rewind if you have to. After you've answered that, let's go ahead and start digging into what a command is. So this is the thing that you enter on the command line, and it's actually the name of a program you want to use. It may not look like a program as you're used to it, but it is. After you've entered that name of the program, you can add a dash, and I've seen people on the Hack 5 YouTube channel use the word tack, so you can add this dash to alter the way the program works. So that's a very nice feature. And on top of that, you can provide arguments for specific parameters for that command. These won't use a dash, they'll just be separate. So quick reflection, what is the command specifically? What is the dash for? And what is an argument? Now take deep breaths here. Soon you'll know what all this means, but I want to give a pop quiz. Is this person logged in as a regular user or root, and how do you know? And now a quick second pop quiz. Do you know what type of shell this person is using? I'm going to give you a hint here. You can see it actually within this box. So as you stare at this, you're going to notice some commands, and I don't see too many tacks. There's one, and that's specifying a certain way they want a program to run. Let's go to this slide and check out some other commands that you can start typing yourself to practice this. If you have a screen full of stuff like this, if you wanted to clear it all out, you just type clear, hit enter, it's all gone. If you need to reset your terminal to use default terminal settings, you can just type in reset. If you want to see who you are, type who, displays who's currently logged in. A W will display currently logged in users and the tasks they're doing, so you can add that. Just typing who am I will display your login name. You have an ID here. This displays the numbers associated with your user account name and group. These are commonly referred to as user IDs, so UID, and then there's GIDs, group IDs. If you want to know what the date is, type that. If you want to see the calendar, I use that one actually quite a bit. Just type in cal. Exit will exit you out of the shell, and uname will display system information. I need to use uname more just out of curiosity. But to better navigate the command line, you'll also need to know several meta characters. For example, if you type in the $, that tells the shell you're about to add a variable. So $score could be a variable with a changing value. You know, in my programming classes, I use the word score as a variable example all the time because score is one of those variables that change often in a program. Now, what does this mean to you? Be careful when you're using commands not to use these meta characters unless you actually mean to. Not going to go too in-depth with meta characters right now, but here they are. You don't want to just use these when you're like creating files or doing anything like that unless you very intentionally mean to. Now, if you intentionally mean to, here's what you can do to avoid a problem. You can use a single quote. And what that does is it tells the shell not to interpret that thing, whatever this thing is that you're choosing. It'll tell the shell not to interpret it as a meta character. Linux may sound confusing, but it's making you stronger, and you're going to have these superpowers before you know it. Which is ironic since I'm talking about meta characters, and in the show The Flash, if you're a superhero, you are called a meta or a meta-human. But we'll go into meta characters more later. The next command I'm about to show you is easily the most important command of all time. It is man. Man pages, short for manual pages, like you'd find when you build something. So if you've ever heard of like somebody reading a manual, the manual tells you how something works. And that's another little joke I have for you here, is that my wife always tells me to read the manual, but I rather put things together myself. But manuals are helpful, especially if you're staring at a computer screen trying to do something. So if you know you're supposed to use a command, but you don't quite know how to use that command to accomplish the thing, you just type in man and the name of the command. After you do that, you'll also be able to see alterations and parameters that are possible for that type of program. So from your machine right here, I want you to go ahead and man cal, just type that in. And then you tell me, what am I looking at, or what would I be learning after I type in that command? Something you should know about these man pages is they're all broken down into these sections. So section 1 will be about commands that just any user can execute, whether you're root or not. The second section will talk about Linux system calls. The third one has these library routines in them. The fourth section is about special device files. Number 5 is file formats, 6 is games, 7 is miscellaneous, and so on. Now, what section would I be in if I'm reading about syscalls? Anybody in my programming class should know what a syscall is. Now, we're going to take this shutdown command for an example, and you might not think there's much to this, but if you man shutdown, you'll be able to learn a lot. You can actually cancel a shutdown by typing in shutdown tac c, and you can add a time variety to it. So if you want to shut down at a certain time, you can specify that. I really want you guys to go to websites like this one, Ask Ubuntu. So from this website here, it'll tell me more information about shutting down after a certain time. Usually you have the person who asks the question here and then answers down here. And if it has a green check mark, that means the person who asked it has approved it. So this person says, I am done using my laptop, but I am using the hotspot in my smartphone. So I want my laptop to be awake for next 1 hour. How can I shut down the laptop after 1 hour of time? So to shut down, run the command sudo shutdown tac p plus 60. That will wait 60 minutes before starting the shutdown sequence. You could do sudo shutdown tac p 1:00 to shut down at 1 a.m. So you could specify the time, and that the computer will use the time that it's displaying wherever it's displaying that at. Now, don't get confused on sites like this. This one's called Ask Ubuntu. It's a Stack Exchange website. And then over here, I have a server fault section that about the same thing. And again, Stack Exchange website, so same basic process. And this question was interesting because it's talking about the difference between powering off and something called halting a system. And both of those were about Linux. Some of you may remember me showing you on Windows using the command prompt how to do something that is basically the same thing we just went over for Linux. So different names for things and different ways to go about things with the same results. That's pretty much computer science for you in a nutshell. So in my school, we like to think about what character trait or attribute is connected to what lessons. Now, for my students who have been used to me for a few years or working with me for a few years, they know I really encourage these 5 things to happen in class during class. So I just want to pause here and see if you can do one of these things related to the lesson. Can you ask me a question? Can you give me an opinion about the lesson? A frustration you had about the lesson? How about a what if? These are pretty fun. These things right here, they make my grading and my life just so much more entertaining. And this last one, not a lot of people do this, but I love it when it happens. They give me a citation. So while learning something during this lesson, they had a question that I'm not answering in the video here. So they go off and they ask that question, they find some information, and then they just report back to me on that process. And I try to encourage that in class. So here we are at the DOL, just to demonstrate your learning of the day. Your task is to restart the computer in 20 minutes after the YouTube mix you've been listening to is over. Question is, what do you type? You can use this to help. You could have also man Shutdown and use that man page to help you answer this DOL question. And also let me say right here, there are multiple ways to get this DOL correct. Now check with me in class if you're unsure and you want to know that you have the correct answer.